Hello, friends. Why did blacksmiths work under the scorching sun, their skin covered with blisters from sparks? Why did builders continue to work in strong winds and pouring rain, their hands cracked and bloodied? How did water carriers endure the unbearable weight of their endless loads, staggering through mud and dust? Today we will talk about this and find out. Welcome to Sleepless Simpleton, where tonight we'll dive into the harsh, unforgiving heart of colonial America, a place where ordinary life was forged in hardship, where every job was a gamble with fate. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm creating here. And leave a comment to share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, let the world fade away, and get ready. Let's begin. Imagine yourself, if you will, not in the quiet comfort of your present, but standing at the threshold of a colonial American tavern. The year could be 1750, or perhaps 1770. Even before you step inside, the air itself feels different. It's a tapestry of scents, the sharp tang of wood smoke from the hearth, mingling with the earthy aroma of spilled ale, the faint, sweet scent of tobacco, and perhaps a distant, underlying hint of unwashed bodies. The sounds are a low, persistent thrum, the clatter of pewter mugs, the murmur of many voices, punctuated by occasional bursts of rough laughter or a shouted command. This isn't just a place for drink, it's the very heartbeat of a colonial settlement, a nexus of news, commerce, and rough-and-tumble social interaction. As you step across the worn threshold, the dim light inside is a stark contrast to the fading daylight. Windows, often small and imperfectly glazed, let in only a hesitant glow, supplemented by the flickering dance of candles and the robust glow of the central hearth, where logs crackle and spit. The floor beneath your feet is likely packed earth or rough-hewn planks, smoothed by countless footsteps, often sticky with spillage. Tables are sturdy, unvarnished wood, scarred by knife marks and the rings of countless tankards. Benches and stools, equally robust, invite weary travelers and local farmers alike to sit. Now, picture yourself not as a patron, but as one of the tavern workers. Perhaps you are a young man, barely out of your apprenticeship, or a woman, strong-backed and quick-witted, navigating this often turbulent environment. Your day began long before dawn, likely with hauling water from the well, stoking the fires, and perhaps helping to prepare the day's meals. Colonial taverns served food, simple, hearty fare like stewed meats, bread, and cheese, and your duties might include tending to the bubbling pot over the fire, the aroma of simmering herbs and vegetables adding another layer to the tavern's complex scent profile. The true work begins, however, when the patrons start to arrive. And they come in all forms, weathered farmers in homespun, dusty drovers guiding their livestock through the streets, merchants discussing trade, and perhaps, on occasion, a traveling gentleman or a soldier. Each brings with them their own demands, their own stories, and their own capacity for revelry or discontent. You are constantly moving, your hands busy. You are filling tankards with cider, rum, or the ubiquitous small beer, a weak, safer alternative to often polluted water. You wipe down tables, fetch more firewood, and listen, always listen, to the endless flow of conversation, some of it mundane, some of it vital for news, and some of it growing steadily more boisterous as the hours wear on and the spirits flow more freely. The air thickens with human breath, pipe smoke, and the heat radiating from the hearth. The noise level rises and falls like a tide, but rarely truly recedes. You learn to anticipate the needs of your patrons, to read the subtle cues of their moods. A red face and slurred words might signal an impending argument. A sudden hush, followed by a low growl, could mean a fight is about to erupt. Brawls, while not an hourly occurrence, were certainly not uncommon. The reasons could be trivial, a perceived insult, a disputed game of cards, or simply the volatile mix of alcohol and tired, sometimes desperate, men. Your role in such moments is precarious: to attempt to mediate, to separate, or simply to stay out of the way, protecting yourself and the fragile, often expensive, wares of the establishment. The crack of a fist against a jaw, the splintering sound of a chair overturned, the shouting of onlookers, These are not rare sounds in the Colonial Tavern. Beyond the immediate chaos of drunken patrons and occasional violence, a more insidious threat always lingered: disease. Taverns were hubs of human interaction, which also made them fertile ground for the spread of illness. Patrons, often traveling from distant settlements, unknowingly carried fevers, smallpox, or influenza. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Shared mugs, unwashed hands, the close proximity of many bodies in a poorly ventilated space, all contributed to a constant, low-level risk of contagion. A persistent cough, a flushed face, a sudden fever, these could quickly sweep through the tavern, affecting both patrons and staff. You, as a worker, were particularly vulnerable, exposed day in and day out to every ailment that walked through the door. Even when the night finally drew to a close, your work was far from over. The last of the patrons would be ushered out, some stumbling into the darkness, others perhaps collapsing into a rented bed within the tavern's own lodging rooms. Then came the arduous task of cleaning, sweeping the floors, scrubbing the tables, emptying the slops, and perhaps preparing for the next day's baking or cooking. The persistent smell of stale ale and wood smoke would cling to your clothes, your hair, a constant reminder of the day's relentless labor. Sleep, when it came, was often in a small, cramped room, perhaps shared with other staff, the sounds of the town or the lingering hum of the tavern itself still present, even in the depths of night. The Colonial Tavern worker's life was one of perpetual motion, constant sensory input, and often an underlying current of danger, both from unruly patrons and the silent, unseen threats of disease. It was a life that demanded resilience, a thick skin, and an enduring capacity for hard work, a world far removed from the quiet ease of our modern comforts. As the bustling tavern fades from our collective imagination, let us turn now to another cornerstone of colonial life, a place where fire and metal met to forge the very implements of survival, the blacksmith's forge. Imagine, if you will, the early morning chill still clinging to the air, but already, from a squat, sturdy building on the edge of the settlement, a column of smoke rises, smelling distinctly of coal and hot iron. This is the smithy, a place of immense physical labor and crucial craftsmanship. Step closer, and the first sensation to truly envelop you is the heat. Even before you enter, the air around the building shimmers with it, a tangible presence. Inside, it is a world defined by the furnace. The forge, a stone or brick hearth with bellows forcing air into its heart, glows with an infernal intensity, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The air is thick with the pervasive scent of burning coal, a metallic tang, and the unique, pungent aroma of hot iron being worked. Fine dust motes, illuminated by the fiery glow, dance in the air, a silent testament to the constant activity. The colonial blacksmith, a figure of strength and endurance, would have already begun his arduous day. His attire would be practical and robust: leather apron, thick breeches, and perhaps a linen shirt, stained with sweat and soot. Protection was minimal, reliant largely on skill and instinct. His tools, themselves products of the forge, lay ready: various tongs for gripping glowing metal, hammers of different weights and shapes, chisels, and punches. The rhythmic clanging of hammer on anvil is the constant soundtrack of his existence, a sound that would penetrate the very bones of the listener. Consider the process itself, a dance between brute force and precise timing. The blacksmith would select a piece of raw iron, perhaps a bar, and using long tongs, thrust it into the glowing heart of the forge. He would then manipulate the bellows, often operated by a foot pedal or a long lever, to intensify the heat, watching intently as the metal transformed from dull gray to a vibrant, almost liquid orange, then to a blinding, incandescent white. This was the moment the metal was hot enough to work. With practiced speed, he would retrieve the glowing bar, careful to avoid the intense radiant heat. The journey from forge to anvil, a heavy block of iron with a hardened face, was swift. Then the real labor began. The hammer would rise and fall, not in a mindless striking, but with a controlled rhythm, each blow shaping the malleable metal. The sparks that flew with each strike were not just fleeting light but tiny fragments of glowing iron, a miniature fireworks display that was both beautiful and dangerous. Imagine the muscles in his arms and shoulders, corded and powerful, moving with a tireless repetition, striking, turning, striking again. The clang of the hammer was often accompanied by the hiss of water as the smith periodically quenched his tools to cool them, or to harden the finished piece. The demands on a colonial blacksmith were vast. He was responsible for producing an astonishing array of essential items. Nails, in countless sizes, were constantly needed for construction. Horseshoes, custom fitted for each animal, were a regular necessity, requiring not only forging skills but an understanding of equine anatomy. Tools for farmers, plowshares, hoes, axes, were vital for cultivating the land. Household implements, hinges, latches, fire pokers, cooking tripods, were also his domain. Each item, from the smallest nail to the largest gate hinge, was crafted by hand, shaped by fire and force. The work was relentlessly physically demanding. The constant exposure to intense heat caused sweat to pour, dehydrating the body. The relentless pounding on the anvil sent vibrations through his entire frame. The strain on his eyes from watching the glowing metal was immense. Accidents were a constant risk, severe burns from carelessly handled iron, cuts from sharp edges, or eye injuries from flying shards of metal. There was no modern safety equipment, no protective eyewear beyond perhaps a sweat-soaked brow. A serious injury could mean not only agonizing pain but the loss of his livelihood, a catastrophic blow in an era without social safety nets. Beyond the physical toil, there was the constant pressure to produce. The community relied on the blacksmith for their very ability to build, farm, and sustain themselves. A broken tool meant lost time, lost crops. A missing horseshoe meant a lame horse, hindering travel or work. The blacksmith's craft was not a luxury. It was a fundamental necessity. His reputation was built on the quality and durability of his work, and the speed with which he could turn raw material into vital implements. As evening approached, and the last of the day's commissions were fulfilled, the fires would slowly be damped down, the clanging would cease, and the lingering heat would gradually dissipate. The blacksmith, covered in soot and sweat, his muscles aching, would finally emerge from the forge, leaving behind the rich, metallic scent of his labor. His hands, rough and calloused, bore the indelible marks of his trade, a silent testament to a day spent battling fire and shaping metal, a grueling yet indispensable existence in the heart of the colonial world. From the fiery heart of the blacksmith's forge, we now shift our gaze to a different kind of labor, one defined not by the clang of metal but by the quiet, often desperate, rhythm of obligation. Let us imagine the life of a colonial indentured servant. This was a common, often necessary, pathway to the new world for many who yearned for a new beginning but lacked the financial means to make the perilous journey across the Atlantic. Picture, if you will, a young man or woman, perhaps from a struggling farm in England or a crowded Irish city, making the difficult decision to leave everything familiar behind. They would sign an indenture, a formal contract, typically for a term of 4 to 7 years. In exchange for their passage to the American colonies, and sometimes for basic provisions like food, clothing, and rudimentary shelter upon arrival, they bound themselves to serve a master. This master, often a planter, a merchant, or a skilled craftsman, would own their labor for the duration of the contract. The promise at the end of this period, often a small plot of land, some tools, or even just a set of new clothes and freedom dues, was a powerful, if sometimes elusive, motivator. The journey itself was the first brutal test. Imagine being packed into the cramped, unsanitary holds of a sailing ship, alongside hundreds of others. The air, thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and stale food, would be stifling. The constant pitching and rolling of the vessel, the dark, damp conditions, and the ever-present threat of disease made the voyage a nightmare for many. Weeks, sometimes months, at sea, with meager rations and brackish water, tested the limits of endurance. Those who survived arrived on colonial shores often weakened, ill, and disoriented, far from the romanticized image of a fresh start. Upon arrival, the indentured servant was, in essence, a commodity. They would often be paraded before potential masters, their physical capabilities assessed, their potential value calculated. The moment the bargain was struck, their new life began, a life of relentless toil that often overshadowed the distant promise of freedom. The daily routine of an indentured servant was dictated entirely by the master's needs and the demands of the colonial economy. If indentured to a planter in the southern colonies, their days would be spent in the relentless heat and humidity of the tobacco or indigo fields. Imagine stooping for hours under the blazing sun, hands raw from planting, weeding, or harvesting. The work was monotonous, backbreaking, and seemingly endless. The air would be thick with the earthy smell of the soil, the buzzing of insects, and the sweat of labor. If serving a craftsman in a bustling town, the work might be different but no less demanding. A cooper's indentured servant would spend hours preparing wood, hammering hoops, and learning the tedious craft of barrel making. A merchant's servant might haul heavy crates, clean shops, or transcribe ledgers by the dim light of a candle late into the night. There was no set workday beyond daylight hours, and often, tasks stretched well into the darkness. Food, while provided, was basic and often repetitive: cornmeal, salt pork, perhaps some vegetables if the harvest was good. Shelter was rudimentary, often a shared space, a loft in a barn, or a simple lean-to, offering little comfort or privacy. Clothing was coarse, functional, and mended until it could no longer hold together. Luxuries were non-existent. The power dynamic between master and servant was absolute. The indenture granted the master legal authority, and while there were some protections for servants, abuses were not uncommon. Beatings, extended terms of service for minor infractions, or outright neglect were grim realities for some. A servant who attempted to escape faced severe penalties if caught, including extended terms of service or even public humiliation. Their lives were not their own. Every waking moment was dedicated to fulfilling the terms of their bond. The social isolation could be profound. Far from their families and familiar communities, surrounded by strangers, many servants experienced deep loneliness. Friendships might form with fellow servants, but the transient nature of their lives, and the strictures of their masters, made deep connections difficult. Yet, amidst the hardship, there was always the glimmer of hope, the promise of freedom dues, at the end of the term. For those who survived the arduous years, who endured the grueling labor and the sometimes harsh treatment, the day of release was a momentous occasion. With their indenture completed, they were, at last, free to pursue their own fortunes. Some succeeded, carving out a new life for themselves, acquiring land, or establishing their own trade. For others, however, the freedom dues proved insufficient, and they remained trapped in a cycle of poverty, their years of servitude having provided only a temporary reprieve from destitution, rather than a true path to prosperity. The life of a colonial indentured servant was a stark reminder of the immense cost of opportunity, a demanding existence forged in the crucible of labor and hope. Having explored the harsh realities of indentured servitude, let us now gently shift our focus to a profession that stood at the very threshold of life, a role of immense responsibility and profound challenge: the colonial midwife. Imagine, if you will, a dimly lit cottage in the dead of night, perhaps a crackling fire offering the only warmth against the winter's chill. A knock, urgent and insistent, echoes through the silence, pulling a woman from her sleep. This is the summons, a call that could come at any hour, in any weather, across any distance. The colonial midwife was a pillar of her community, often an older, experienced woman, highly respected for her knowledge and courage. Unlike the formally trained doctors who were rare and mostly served the wealthy in towns, the midwife was the primary healthcare provider for women during childbirth, especially in rural areas. Her training was not from books or universities, but from generations of accumulated wisdom, passed down through oral tradition, observation, and direct experience, often gained by assisting other midwives from a young age. Her journey to a laboring woman was often arduous. Imagine her pulling on her sturdy cloak, perhaps clutching a small basket containing her essential tools, clean linen cloths, perhaps a small knife or scissors for cutting the umbilical cord, and a few herbal remedies, teas to calm, poultices to soothe. The path might be a muddy track, a snow-covered lane, or a winding forest trail, all navigated by the feeble light of a lantern or the pale glow of the moon. The sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures, would accompany her solitary journey. Time was often of the essence, yet travel was slow and treacherous. Upon arrival, the atmosphere in the laboring home would be charged with a quiet tension, a mixture of hope and deep-seated fear. Childbirth in colonial times was a perilous undertaking, fraught with immense risk for both mother and child. There was little understanding of germ theory. Hands were often unwashed, instruments unsterilized. Infections, such as puerperal fever, were rampant and often fatal, silently claiming lives after seemingly successful deliveries. The air would be heavy with anticipation, perhaps the smell of sweat and fear, and the distant, muffled cries of the woman in labor. The midwife's role was multifaceted. She was a comforter, offering words of encouragement and gentle reassurance to the laboring mother. She was an observer, closely monitoring the progress of labor, relying on her intuition and experience to discern whether the birth was proceeding normally. She was a physical support, helping the woman find comfortable positions, perhaps applying warm compresses or offering sips of herbal tea. And crucially, she was a skilled practitioner, knowing when and how to intervene with her rudimentary knowledge and tools if complications arose. Imagine the limitations. There were no pain medications beyond simple herbal concoctions. Instruments were basic, perhaps a blunt hook for a breech birth, or in desperate cases, crude tools to save the mother's life if the child could not be delivered. Her decisions were made based on centuries of folk wisdom, rather than modern medical science. A prolonged labor, a baby presenting in an unusual position, or uncontrolled bleeding, these were terrifying scenarios that the midwife faced with only her hands, her experience, and her courage. The sounds of the birthing chamber would be primal, the low moans, the sharp cries, the gasping breaths of the woman fighting for life. The midwife, her face etched with concentration, would be a steady presence, her voice calm and firm. She would whisper encouragement, wipe a feverish brow, and guide the mother through the agonizing stages of labor. The emotional toll of this work was immense. She witnessed not only the miracle of new life but also, tragically often, the heartbreaking reality of loss. Stillbirths were common, as were the deaths of mothers from complications that today are easily managed. Each loss was a heavy burden, a quiet sorrow carried alongside the joy of successful births. Once the child was born, if all went well, the midwife's duties continued. She would sever the umbilical cord, clean the newborn, and instruct the mother on early care. She might stay for a few days to ensure both mother and child were recovering, offering advice on breastfeeding, hygiene, and nutrition. Her work was not just about delivery, it was about the immediate postnatal survival of two precious lives. The life of a colonial midwife was one of profound dedication and constant exposure to the rawest edges of human existence. Her hands, though often scarred and calloused, were the first to greet new life into a challenging world. She carried the weight of her community's hopes and fears, her wisdom and resilience a beacon in the often dark and uncertain hours of colonial childbirth. Her story is one of quiet heroism, a testament to the enduring strength and unwavering care that shaped the very fabric of early American life. From the intimate, often poignant, world of the midwife, our journey now carries us to the wild, untamed expanse of the colonial sea. Let us imagine the life of a colonial fisherman, a solitary figure against the vastness of the Atlantic, his livelihood and his very existence bound to the capricious moods of the ocean. This was a life of constant peril, profound patience, and relentless labor, a stark contrast to the grounded rhythms of farm or town. Picture, if you will, the pre-dawn darkness of a coastal village. The air is sharp and bracing, carrying the unmistakable scent of salt and fish, mingling with the faint aroma of pine pitch and damp wood. The rhythmic lapping of water against boat hulls is the only sound, a subtle overture to the day's arduous work. The fisherman, bundled in coarse wool and oilskins, would already be stirring, preparing his vessel and gear. His hands, even in the chill of the morning, would be calloused and strong, accustomed to the bite of rough ropes and the chill of wet nets. His vessel would be modest, a small schooner or a sturdy dory, built for resilience against the waves rather than comfort. It would smell of brine, tar, and fish, a working smell that permeated every fiber of his being. Before he even left the harbor, there would be meticulous preparations, checking lines, mending nets, baiting hooks with whatever scraps were available. Every knot had to be secure, every piece of equipment reliable. Failure could mean not just a lost catch, but a lost life. As he steered his small boat out from the shelter of the harbor, the world would begin to lighten, slowly revealing the immense, indifferent expanse of the ocean. The land would recede, becoming a distant, fading silhouette. The only companions now were the cry of gulls, the vast, shifting expanse of the sea, and the boat itself, creaking and groaning as it met the swells. The rhythmic slap of waves against the hull, the whisper of the wind in the rigging, and the distant calls of other fishing boats would form the only sounds for hours. The work itself was a test of endurance. Imagine the constant motion of the boat, rising and falling with the waves, a subtle yet persistent strain on the body. The cold, even in summer, could be bone-chilling, particularly when spray lashed over the bow, soaking clothes and chilling skin. In winter, the conditions were truly brutal, ice coating the rigging, freezing spray transforming into razor-sharp crystals, and the constant threat of hypothermia. Hands would quickly become numb, fingers stiff, making the intricate work of handling lines and nets incredibly difficult. The act of fishing was a patient game of chance. Whether dropping lines for cod, hauling in traps for lobster, or casting nets for mackerel, it required immense physical effort and an intuitive understanding of the sea's hidden rhythms. Imagine hauling heavy, waterlogged nets laden with fish over the gunwale, the sheer weight of the catch straining every muscle. The deck would quickly become slick with fish guts, scales, and seawater, a precarious surface for working. The air would fill with the unmistakable, pungent aroma of fresh catch, mingled with the briny scent of the ocean. But beyond the physical toll, there was the ever-present danger of the sea itself. Storms could gather with terrifying speed, transforming a calm expanse into a churning, violent maelstrom. Waves, once mere swells, could become towering walls of water, threatening to swamp or capsize the small vessel. The wind, once a gentle breeze, could howl with destructive force, tearing sails and snapping masts. Imagine fighting against the power of nature, clinging to the rigging, desperately trying to keep the boat upright, the roar of the wind and waves deafening, the spray blinding. Many a fisherman, caught unawares or simply overpowered, never returned to shore, swallowed by the indifferent depths. Even on calm days, other perils lurked. Hidden shoals, shifting currents, or unexpected fog could lead to disaster. A sudden slip on a wet deck, a line snagging a limb, or a heavy piece of equipment swinging wildly could cause serious injury, far from any help. The isolation of the open sea meant that a simple accident could quickly become a fatal one. When the catch was finally made, and the journey back to harbor began, the work was still not over. The fish had to be cleaned, gutted, and perhaps salted or dried for preservation, a messy, smelly, and laborious process that continued long after the boat was tied up at the dock. The smell of fish, a constant companion, would cling to everything, clothes, skin, hair, and the very walls of his humble home. The life of a colonial fisherman was a testament to human resilience in the face of nature's raw power. It was a life lived on the edge, where survival was a daily gamble against the elements. Yet, it was also a life deeply connected to the vital pulse of the natural world, providing sustenance and commerce for the burgeoning colonies, a quiet, enduring struggle against the relentless, beautiful indifference of the sea. From the unpredictable and dangerous realm of the open sea, we now turn our attention to a more grounded, yet equally demanding, colonial profession, that of the miller. Imagine, if you will, the gentle, persistent murmur of a stream, its waters harnessed by human ingenuity. Follow its course, and you will eventually come upon a sturdy, often weather-beaten structure, its large water wheels slowly, relentlessly turning, dripping with the cool, fresh water. This is the heart of the colonial community's sustenance, the grist mill, and within its dusty confines, the miller toils. The air around the mill carries a distinct, pervasive scent, the earthy, sweet aroma of grain, mingling with the faint, woody smell of damp planks and the subtle, mechanical scent of turning gears. Inside, the soundscape is dominated by a deep, resonant hum, the rhythmic groan and rumble of the massive millstones, turning one against the other. It is a sound that vibrates through the very floorboards, a constant presence that permeates every aspect of the miller's life. Dust, a fine, pale veil, hangs perpetually in the air, coating every surface and settling subtly on hair and clothing. The colonial miller was a crucial figure in his community. He was the vital link between the farmer's harvest and the daily bread that fed every family. Farmers from miles around would bring their precious grain, corn, wheat, rye, oats, often in heavy sacks slung over the backs of horses or loaded onto ox carts. Imagine the parade of these conveyances, arriving at the mill, the farmers eager to transform their bounty into the flour and meal essential for their very survival. The miller's work began with the arrival of these sacks. He would meticulously weigh the grain, ensuring fairness in the transaction, as he often took a portion, known as the miller's toll, as his payment. Then came the laborious process of preparing the grain for grinding. It might need to be cleaned of stones, husks, and other debris, a tedious task performed by hand, ensuring that only pure grain entered the grinding process. The heart of the mill, and the miller's primary focus, were the massive millstones. These were typically two large, circular stones, often weighing several tons each. The bottom stone, known as the bed stone, was stationary, while the upper stone, the brunner stone, rotated just above it. The grain would be fed through a hole in the center of the runner stone, drawn between the two surfaces, and ground by the immense friction and weight. Maintaining these stones was a critical and skilled aspect of the miller's craft. Periodically, they needed to be dressed, a process of chipping away at the stone to resharpen their grooves and ensure efficient grinding. Imagine the painstaking work, lying on his back, chisel and hammer in hand, enduring the dust and strain to keep his essential tools in peak condition. The control of the grinding process was paramount. The miller had to constantly adjust the gap between the stones, ensuring the correct fineness of the flour or meal. Too wide, and the grain would be coarse and uneven; too narrow, and the stones could overheat or clog. This adjustment was often done by eye and by feel, a skill honed over years of practice. The constant vibration of the machinery, the low rumble of the stones, and the steady flow of grain demanded his unwavering attention. The work was relentlessly dusty. Fine flour particles would cling to everything, penetrating clothing, hair, and even the lungs. While not as overtly dangerous as working with fire or the sea, the mill had its own subtle hazards. The heavy machinery, with its massive gears and belts, presented a constant risk of entanglement or crushing injuries if one was not constantly vigilant. The damp environment, necessary for the water wheel, could also lead to slippery surfaces and falls. Moreover, the miller was often more than just a grinder of grain. He was often a local entrepreneur, a community hub, and sometimes a banker of sorts, holding grain in storage for farmers until they needed it. He had to be trustworthy, meticulous in his record-keeping, and fair in his dealings. His reputation was built on the quality of his flour and the honesty of his character. As the day waned, and the last of the farmers collected their freshly milled produce, the miller's tasks would shift to cleaning and maintenance. Sweeping away the accumulated dust, checking the machinery for wear and tear, and preparing for the next day's deluge of grain. The persistent hum of the mill would slowly fade, replaced by the quiet sounds of the evening. The miller, tired and covered in the fine white dust of his trade, would finally return to his humble dwelling, carrying with him the pervasive smell of his honest, monotonous, and utterly essential labor. His life was a testament to the steady, vital rhythm of colonial agriculture, transforming the raw bounty of the land into the very sustenance of human existence. From the rhythmic hum of the gristmill, we venture now into the quieter, more solitary expanses of the colonial wilderness, to contemplate the life of a colonial shepherd. Imagine, if you will, the vast, undulating landscape of early America, not yet crisscrossed by roads, but dotted with nascent settlements. Beyond the cleared fields and burgeoning towns lay the deep, murmuring forests, the rolling hills, and the wide, untamed meadows. Here, often on the periphery of civilization, the shepherd carved out a lonely, yet deeply connected, existence. The air in the shepherd's world was clean and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth, wild grasses, and the faint, sweet odor of sheep. The sounds were primarily those of nature: the bleating of the flock, the gentle rustle of wind through trees, the distant call of a bird, and the constant, subtle hum of insects. His days were dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, and the needs of his charges. The colonial shepherd was more than just a caretaker of animals. He was a sentinel, a guardian, and often, a solitary figure against the vastness of the natural world. Sheep and cattle were immensely valuable assets in the colonies, providing not only wool and meat but also hides for leather and for cattle, milk and labor. Protecting these animals was paramount, and that responsibility fell almost entirely on the shepherd's shoulders. Imagine the dawn. The shepherd, waking often before the sun, would emerge from his crude shelter, perhaps a small, temporary hut or even just a lean-to built against a rock outcropping. His loyal dogs, essential companions and tireless workers, would stir at his side. The morning chill would be profound, clinging to the mist that often shrouded the valleys. His first task would be to survey his flock, counting them, checking for any signs of illness or injury, and ensuring none had strayed during the night. Then began the slow, deliberate process of guiding the animals to pasture. The shepherd's life was one of constant, gentle motion, herding the flock across vast stretches of land, always searching for the richest grazing areas. This wasn't a leisurely stroll. It required an intimate knowledge of the landscape, where the best grasses grew, where water sources could be found, and crucially, where dangers might lurk. His eyes would constantly scan the horizon, his ears alert to every sound, for the wilderness held many threats. The most prominent danger came from predators. Wolves, bears, and even large wildcats still roamed the colonial forests in significant numbers. Imagine the sudden tension in the air, the agitated bleating of the sheep, the low growl of the dogs as a shadow moved at the edge of the tree-line. The shepherd had to be ready to act, armed often with little more than a stout staff, his courage, and the fierce loyalty of his trained dogs. Confronting a hungry wolf or a territorial bear was a terrifying prospect, a direct struggle for survival that could erupt with little warning. The loss of even a single animal to predation was a significant economic blow, and a failure on the shepherd's part. Beyond predators, the weather was an equally relentless adversary. Sudden, violent thunderstorms could stampede a flock, scattering them across miles of unfamiliar territory. Imagine the driving rain, the blinding flashes of lightning, the roar of thunder, and the frantic attempts to keep the terrified animals together. In winter, blizzards could descend with crippling force, burying the landscape in deep snow. The shepherd would tirelessly work to find shelter for his flock, perhaps leading them to a protected valley or attempting to clear snow from grazing areas. A bitter cold snap could mean the loss of many young or weak animals to exposure. Frostbite was a constant threat to the shepherd himself, as he endured long hours in the biting wind and snow. The isolation of the shepherd's life was profound. Days and weeks could pass with no human contact beyond the occasional passing traveler or a visit from the farmer who owned the flock. His conversations were largely with his dogs, his observations of the natural world, and the silent company of his animals. This solitude demanded a particular kind of resilience, an inner quietude, and a profound self-reliance. Evenings brought the task of gathering the flock into a protective enclosure, ensuring their safety through the night. Then, by the meager light of a small fire, the shepherd might mend his clothes, whittle a piece of wood, or simply sit and listen to the sounds of the wilderness, a vast symphony of unseen life. His meals would be simple, often consisting of hardtack, dried meat, and perhaps some foraged berries. The life of a colonial shepherd was a continuous cycle of watchful vigilance, patient guiding, and physical endurance. It was a humble yet essential role, safeguarding the very resources that underpinned colonial society. His days, though spent in solitude, were a testament to the quiet strength required to live in harmony, and often in direct confrontation, with the raw, untamed beauty of the American wilderness. From the expansive, untamed world of the shepherd and his flock, we now move indoors, to the heart of many colonial homes, where another essential, yet often monotonous, form of labor unfolded, the toil of the colonial weaver. Imagine, if you will, a small, often dimly lit room within a humble cottage or farmhouse. The air within this space is thick with the fine dust of fiber, wool, flax, or cotton, and carries a faint, earthy smell of raw materials. At the center of this room stands the loom, a large, imposing wooden contraption of beams, harnesses, and treadles, taking up a significant portion of the available space. It is a testament to the era's ingenious craftsmanship, a complex machine built for the repetitive, rhythmic creation of cloth. The colonial weaver, often a woman, was an integral part of her household self-sufficiency. In a time when ready-made clothing was a luxury, and imported fabrics were expensive, the ability to produce one's own cloth was not just a skill but a necessity. Her year-round cycle of labor began long before the actual weaving. Consider the raw materials. If it was wool, the process started with the sheep. After shearing, the raw wool was greasy and full of burrs and dirt. It had to be meticulously cleaned, washed repeatedly in hot, soapy water, often in large tubs outdoors, then rinsed and dried. Imagine the sheer physical effort of handling wet, heavy wool, the repetitive motion of wringing and rinsing. Once clean, the wool then needed to be carded, a process of pulling the fibers between two spiked paddles to untangle and align them, creating soft, fluffy rolls ready for spinning. The sound of the cards scraping together, a gentle yet persistent rasping, would fill the air. If the fiber was flax for linen, the process was even more laborious and multi-staged, involving retting, soaking in water to rot the outer stalk, scutching, breaking the woody core to separate the fibers, and heckling, combing the fibers to refine them. Each step was time-consuming and physically demanding. Once the fibers were prepared, they moved to the spinning wheel. Here, the weaver, or often her daughters, would spend countless hours, their hands gracefully feeding the prepared fibers onto the spindle, transforming the soft rolls into strong, continuous threads. The gentle, whirring sound of the spinning wheel, a hypnotic, meditative drone, was a constant backdrop to daily life in many colonial homes. It was a skill that required immense dexterity and patience, ensuring an even and strong thread, the foundation of all good cloth. Finally, the spun threads were ready for the loom. The warping process came first, where hundreds of long threads were carefully measured and arranged onto the loom's frame, forming the longitudinal threads that would create the fabric. This was a painstaking task, requiring meticulous attention to detail to ensure even tension and proper alignment. A single mistake could unravel hours of work. Then came the weaving itself. The weaver would sit or stand at the loom, her feet operating the treadles that alternately lifted and lowered different sets of warp threads, creating a shed, or opening. Her hands would then swiftly pass the shuttle, holding the weft thread through this opening, from one side to the other. With each pass, she would then use the reed or batten to beat the weft thread firmly into place, compacting the fabric. This was a highly repetitive motion: treadle, shuttle, beat, treadle, shuttle, beat. Imagine the rhythm, the creak of the wooden frame, the soft swish of the shuttle, the thud of the batten. Hour after hour, day after day, the pattern would slowly emerge, inch by painstaking inch, a testament to her dedication. The cloth she produced was often coarse, practical, and durable, linsey-woolsey, a blend of linen and wool, homespun linen, or rough woolen blankets. It was not always aesthetically pleasing by modern standards, but it was vital, providing warmth and cover for her family. The work was physically taxing, leading to strained eyes from working in dim light, aching backs from prolonged sitting, and calloused hands from manipulating the raw fibers and heavy loom parts. The dust from the fibers could irritate the lungs, a subtle, long-term hazard. But beyond the physical toil, there was the mental fortitude required for such repetitive, solitary work. It demanded concentration, patience, and a deep understanding of the craft. As the daylight faded, the loom would fall silent, its half-finished cloth hanging like a promise for the next day. The weaver, tired but with a quiet sense of accomplishment, would shift to other household duties, but the rhythm of the loom, and the feel of the fibers, would remain a constant, familiar presence in her body and mind. Her tireless efforts were the very threads that held her family, and indeed her community, clothed and warm against the harsh realities of the colonial world. From the quiet, repetitive rhythm of the weaver's loom, we now step out onto the bustling, noisy thoroughfares of a colonial town, to immerse ourselves in the vibrant, yet challenging, world of the colonial street vendor. Imagine, if you will, the narrow, unpaved streets of Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston on a busy market day in the mid-18th century. The air is alive with a cacophony of sounds, the clatter of horse-drawn carts over cobblestones or packed earth, the distant bellow of livestock, the ringing of church bells, and above all, the incessant, overlapping cries of countless individuals hawking their wares. The smells are equally diverse and often overwhelming, the pungent aroma of fresh produce from the countryside mingling with the sweet scent of baked goods, the acrid tang of wood smoke, the musk of horses and unwashed humanity, and an underlying, pervasive scent of refuse and damp earth. This was not a world of discreet shops and quiet transactions. It was a sensory explosion, a raw and immediate marketplace. The colonial street vendor was often a person of modest means, relying entirely on their daily sales to survive. They didn't own a fixed storefront, nor did they have the capital to invest in a permanent stall. Instead, their shop was a portable basket, a small cart, or simply a tray balanced on their head. Their inventory was typically small, perishable, and highly specific: fresh eggs gathered that morning, sweet apples from a small orchard, humble loaves of cornbread baked in a home oven, handmade candles, or perhaps small, useful notions like pins and ribbons. Imagine the dawn, long before most of the town stirred. The street vendor would be up, preparing their limited stock. If it was bread, the warmth from the still cooling oven would linger in the small home. If it was eggs, they would be carefully placed in a padded basket. Every item was precious, representing hours of effort and the potential for the day's meager income. Once prepared, the journey to the market square or the busiest street corners began. This itself was a daily test of endurance, often involving walking miles with heavy loads. A woman carrying a large basket of apples might feel the persistent ache in her shoulders and back long before she reached her selling spot. Upon arrival, the true work of hawking commenced. This was an art form in itself, requiring a strong voice, endless patience, and a thick skin. Imagine the vendor crying out their offerings, their voice rising and falling in a rhythmic chant above the general din. Fresh bread! Hot from the oven! Get your fresh bread! Or, sweet apples! Juicy apples! Only a penny apiece! They had to compete with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other vendors, each vying for the attention of passing customers. The day was spent on their feet, constantly moving, or standing for hours in one spot, enduring the elements. The blazing summer sun could beat down relentlessly, making the pavement radiate heat and causing sweat to stream. In winter, the biting wind and cold could seep into every layer of clothing, making fingers and toes numb. Rain could quickly ruin perishable goods and send customers scurrying for shelter, leaving the vendor exposed and struggling. Beyond the physical discomfort, there was the constant pressure of sales. Every transaction mattered. A bad day meant no food on the table, no firewood for the hearth. Customers could be fickle, demanding, or attempt to haggle relentlessly, trying to squeeze every last penny from the vendor. Competition was fierce, and a vendor selling a slightly better or cheaper product could quickly steal away a customer. There was no guaranteed wage, no safety net. Their livelihood was entirely dependent on their ability to entice passers-by to part with their precious coins. Street vendors were also vulnerable. They carried their entire capital with them, making them targets for petty thieves. They had to be constantly vigilant, watching their stock and their earnings. They also faced the constant threat of public ridicule, or even harassment from unruly patrons or mischievous children. As evening approached, and the crowds thinned, the vendor would pack up their remaining goods, the exhaustion settling deep into their bones. The unsold items would have to be accounted for, perhaps consumed if perishable, or saved for another attempt tomorrow. The journey home, often in the fading light, would be quieter, the streets emptying, the echoes of the day's cries fading into the twilight. The life of a colonial street vendor was one of incessant effort, acute vulnerability, and relentless competition. It was a humble yet vital role, bringing goods directly to the people in a vibrant, sensory explosion of colonial commerce. Their voices, though long silent, remain an enduring symbol of the ceaseless daily struggle for survival in the bustling, demanding world of early America. From the bustling, often chaotic, streets where vendors hawk their daily wares, let us now step into a quieter, more focused space, the dim, often cramped workshop of a colonial shoemaker. Imagine, if you will, the interior of such a place, perhaps tucked away on a side street or within a humble dwelling. The air is heavy with the distinct, rich scent of cured leather, mingling with the faint, sharp aroma of beeswax and the subtle, earthy smell of wood shavings. The sounds within the shoemaker's workshop are rhythmic and repetitive, yet profoundly different from the clamor of the street. There is the steady tap-tap-tap of small hammers, the soft hiss of a waxed thread being pulled taut, and the gentle creak of leather as it is manipulated. Light, often scarce, would filter in through a small window, supplemented by the flickering glow of a tallow candle or an oil lamp, casting long, dancing shadows across the tools and hides. The colonial shoemaker, or cordwainer, as he was often known, was a highly skilled artisan, essential to every community. In an era before mass production, every pair of shoes was a custom-made item, crafted by hand from raw materials. His clients ranged from the humblest farmer needing sturdy work boots to the gentry requiring finer, more elegant footwear. The process of making a single pair of shoes was a meticulous, multi-stage endeavor, demanding immense patience, precision, and physical dexterity. It began with the leather. Imagine the shoemaker carefully examining a large hide, feeling its texture, assessing its thickness, and determining which parts would be best suited for the sole, the upper, or the lining. He would then meticulously cut the various patterns, each piece shaped to form a component of the final shoe. This required sharp knives and a steady hand, ensuring minimal waste of the valuable material. Next came the shaping of the shoe's foundation, the last. This was a wooden form, carved to approximate the shape and size of a human foot. The shoemaker might have a collection of lasts in different sizes, or even custom-carved lasts for specific clients. The cut leather pieces, particularly the upper, of the shoe, would be carefully stretched and pulled over the last, then temporarily secured with small nails or tacks. This was a critical step, requiring strength and a keen eye to achieve the correct shape and fit. Then came the incredibly labor-intensive process of stitching. Imagine the shoemaker, seated on a low stool, often hunched over his work. He would use a sharp awl to punch small holes through the thick leather, then, with both hands, meticulously pass waxed linen thread through these holes. The thread itself was often prepared by hand, twisted and coated with beeswax to make it strong and water-resistant. He might use 2 needles, one on each end of a long piece of thread, passing them simultaneously through the holes, creating a strong, durable seam. The constant pulling and tightening of the thread, the repetitive motion of his hands, would be a ceaseless activity. The seams were not just functional, they had to be tight and consistent to prevent water from seeping in and to ensure the longevity of the shoe. This hand stitching was particularly evident where the upper met the sole, a crucial joint that bore the brunt of daily wear. The soles themselves were often made from multiple layers of thick, sturdy leather, carefully cut, and then painstakingly stitched or pegged to the upper. As the shoe slowly took shape, other components would be added, a stiffener at the heel, a toe cap for protection, and perhaps decorative elements for finer shoes. The final touches involved burnishing the edges, polishing the leather, and attaching a heel, often also made of layered leather or wood. The small, sharp taps of his hammer, as he secured the heel, would punctuate the otherwise quiet work. The work was physically demanding and required immense fine motor skill. The constant hunching over, the strain on the eyes from working in poor light, and the repetitive movements could lead to chronic aches and pains. The sharp tools presented a constant risk of nicks and cuts. Moreover, the shoemaker often had to work long hours, especially during busy seasons, to meet demand. But there was also a deep satisfaction in the craft. Each finished pair of shoes was a tangible product of skill, patience, and dedication. They were not just items of clothing, they were essential tools for navigating the often rough terrain of colonial life, protecting feet from stones, mud, and cold. The colonial shoemaker, with his quiet focus and tireless hands, was a fundamental part of the economic and practical fabric of his community, a silent guardian of every step taken on the long and challenging path of early American existence. From the meticulous craft of the shoemaker, shaping leather into protective footwear, we now turn our attention to another fundamental artisan of colonial life, the baker. Imagine, if you will, the earliest hours of a colonial day, long before the sun has fully risen, when most of the settlement is still steeped in slumber. From a small, often stand-alone building or a dedicated corner of a large kitchen, a plume of wood smoke rises, carrying with it the warm, comforting scent of baking bread. This is the Colonial Bakehouse, a place of intense heat, rhythmic labor, and the creation of the most essential of foodstuffs. The air within the bakehouse is dense with the aroma of yeast, warm flour, and the distinct, slightly charred scent of wood ash. The central feature is the clay oven, a massive, domed structure, often built into a wall or standing independently, its interior glowing with residual heat from the earlier fire. The sounds are hushed in the pre-dawn quiet, the gentle clatter of wooden peels, the soft thud of dough being kneaded, and the distant, subtle crackle of embers within the oven. The colonial baker's day began not just before dawn, but often in the dead of night. His first task, hours before any bread could be baked, was to fire the oven. Imagine gathering logs, splitting kindling, and carefully building a roaring fire within the clay dome. This fire would burn for hours, heating the thick clay walls to an immense, even temperature. The baker would monitor the heat by hand, by eye, or perhaps by throwing a little flour into the oven to see how quickly it browned. This required immense skill and judgment, as too hot an oven would burn the crust, and too cool would result in dense, uncooked loaves. The radiant heat from the oven itself would quickly raise the temperature in the bakehouse, making it a sweltering environment even in the chill of winter. Once the oven reached the desired temperature, the ashes and embers would be meticulously raked out, a dusty, hot, and precise task, as any lingering ash could ruin the bread. Then, the oven floor would be swept clean, often with a wet cloth attached to a long pole, creating a satisfying hiss as the water evaporated on the hot surface. Only then was the oven ready to receive its precious cargo. Meanwhile, the equally laborious process of dough preparation would be underway. Colonial bakers worked with simple ingredients: flour, water, yeast, often a sourdough starter carried over from previous batches, and salt. Imagine the sheer physical effort of mixing large quantities of these ingredients by hand in enormous wooden troughs. The flour, often coarsely ground, would be scooped from sacks, adding to the fine dust that permeated the air. Then came the kneading, a strenuous, rhythmic process of pushing, pulling, and folding the heavy, sticky dough until it achieved the desired elasticity. This was a full-body workout, performed repeatedly for each large batch of bread. The scent of developing yeast, a slightly sour, yeasty aroma, would fill the air around the dough. Once kneaded, the dough would be left to proof, to rise, in large wooden bowls, covered with cloths, in a warm corner of the bakehouse. The baker would then meticulously shape the risen dough into individual loaves or corn cakes, carefully placing them onto long, wooden peels, flat shovels used for loading bread into the deep oven. Now came the delicate dance of loading the oven. Imagine the baker, leaning into the intense heat, his face flushed, deftly sliding the peels laden with unbaked loaves onto the scorching oven floor. He had to be quick and precise, arranging the loaves to ensure even baking without burning himself or disturbing the delicate dough. The heat radiating from the open oven mouth would be stifling, demanding both speed and resilience. While the bread baked, the baker would not rest. He might be preparing the next batch of dough, cleaning equipment, or perhaps baking other items like small pastries or simple pies. The bakehouse was a continuous cycle of preparation, heat, and production. Finally, the moment of truth, unloading the oven. With the same long peels, the baker would carefully retrieve the golden brown loaves, their crusts perfectly crisp, their interiors fragrant and soft. The smell of freshly baked bread, warm and inviting, would now dominate the air, a reward for the long hours of toil. The work was relentless. Bakers often worked through the night to ensure fresh bread was available for sale at dawn. The constant exposure to intense heat, the physical strain of kneading and lifting, and the pervasive flour dust presented subtle but significant health challenges. Burns were common, and the lung irritation from the flour dust was a silent, long-term affliction. Yet, the Colonial baker held a position of quiet honor. His product was fundamental to life, the very staff of existence. The warm, comforting presence of his bakehouse, and the delicious aroma of his daily output, were a reassuring constant in the bustling, demanding world of colonial America. His hands, perpetually dusted with flour, were the instruments of sustenance, feeding the hungry mouths of a growing nation. From the warm, comforting confines of the Colonial bakehouse, we now step outside into the raw, often unforgiving, environment where structures rise from the earth. Let us envision the life of a colonial builder, a man whose hands shaped the very foundations of the burgeoning settlements, transforming raw timber and stone into homes, barns, and meeting houses. This was a profession demanding immense physical strength, practical ingenuity, and unwavering resilience against the elements. Imagine, if you will, a clearing in a newly settled area. The air is thick with the scent of freshly cut timber, sawdust, and the earthy aroma of disturbed soil. The sounds are a symphony of construction, the rhythmic thud of axes, the sharp ringing of hammers on nails, the creak and groan of ropes as heavy beams are hoisted, and the shouts of men coordinating their efforts. This was not a quiet endeavor. It was a loud, laborious transformation of the landscape. The colonial builder, often a housewright or carpenter, was a master of many trades. He was an architect drawing upon traditional designs and his own practical knowledge. He was a lumberjack, often felling the trees himself or supervising their cutting. He was a rough carpenter, shaping massive timbers with hand tools. And he was a mason, laying stone foundations or constructing chimneys. His workday began with the first light, and often continued until darkness forced a halt. Consider the raw materials. Unlike today, where lumber arrives pre-cut from a mill, the colonial builder often started with a standing tree. Imagine the arduous task of felling these towering giants with nothing but a broad axe and a crosscut saw. The sheer physical power required to bring down a massive oak or pine, to then hew it into square timbers for framing, was immense. Each swing of the axe, each pull of the saw, was a deliberate, muscle-straining effort, performed hour after hour. The wood chips would fly, the sawdust would settle, and the scent of fresh sap would fill the air. Once the timbers were prepared, the true construction began. Foundations, if made of stone, involved digging deep into the earth, hauling heavy rocks, and painstakingly fitting them together to create a stable base. This was back-breaking work, often performed in muddy, unstable conditions. The chilling dampness of the earth, the persistent ache in the lower back, and the constant strain on the hands were ever-present realities. Then came the raising of the timber frame. This was often a communal effort, a raising bee, where neighbors would gather to help lift the massive, mortise and tenon-jointed timbers into place. Imagine the coordinated shouts, the straining muscles, the thick ropes, and the precarious balance as massive beams, some weighing hundreds of pounds, were slowly, carefully hoisted aloft and fitted into their precisely cut joints. A single slip, a misplaced hand, or a moment of carelessness could lead to catastrophic injury or even death, as falling timbers could crush a man instantly. The air would be thick with tension and effort during such moments. Once the frame was up, the more detailed work began, sawing and fitting smaller timbers for floor joists and roof rafters, nailing on the sheathing, and then laboriously splitting wooden shingles for the roof, each one nailed by hand. Nails were expensive and often had to be forged by the local blacksmith, making every single one a valuable commodity. The builder's life was one of constant exposure to the elements. In the scorching heat of summer, the sun would beat down relentlessly, dehydrating the body, causing sweat to pour, and making the heavy labor even more draining. The wood itself would radiate heat, and the tools would grow hot to the touch. In the biting cold of winter, hands would quickly grow numb, fingers stiff, making fine work nearly impossible. The ground could be frozen solid, making digging arduous, and the wind could cut through layers of clothing. Rain could turn a construction site into a quagmire, making footing treacherous and work impossible, costing precious time and money. Injuries were a constant companion, splinters deep in the hands, cuts from sharp axes and saws, sprains from lifting heavy objects, and broken bones from falls or falling debris. There were no safety helmets, no steel-toed boots, no harnesses for working at height. Every step was taken with caution, every movement calculated, but accidents were an unavoidable part of the trade. The colonial builder did not just construct buildings, he built communities. His creations provided shelter, warmth, and the very spaces in which colonial life unfolded. His days were long, his labor hard, and his body bore the indelible marks of his demanding craft. His quiet, enduring strength, pitted against the raw materials of the land and the relentless forces of nature, laid the physical foundations of a new society, one beam, one stone, one nail at a time. From the solid, constructed world of the colonial builder, we now shift our focus to a more fluid, yet equally essential, daily struggle, the life of a colonial water carrier. Imagine, if you will, a colonial town or rural homestead, perhaps in the humid depths of summer or the biting chill of winter. In this era, there was no indoor plumbing, no convenient tap from which to draw fresh water. Every drop needed for cooking, washing, drinking, or cleaning had to be physically transported from its source. This arduous, relentless task often fell to the youngest members of a household, or to dedicated laborers in more populated areas. The air in the colonial environment, though cleaner than in some modern cities, could still be heavy with the scent of unpaved streets, animal waste, and the various activities of daily life. The sounds were often punctuated by the creak of wagon wheels, the distant calls of vendors, and the ubiquitous sounds of human and animal activity. But for the water carrier, there was also the distinct, sloshing sound of water within buckets, a rhythmic accompaniment to their tireless journey. Consider the source of this precious commodity. It might be a communal well, often located in the center of a village or on the town common. Imagine approaching this well, its stone or wooden casing weathered by countless hands and seasons. The process of drawing water itself was a minor feat of strength, lowering a heavy bucket on a rope or chain, waiting for it to fill, and then slowly, laboriously, winding it back up, hand over hand, the muscles in the arms and back straining with each rotation of the crank. The cool, damp scent of the well, and the refreshing sound of water splashing into the bucket, would offer a brief respite before the real labor began. Alternatively, the water source might be a nearby river or stream. Imagine the journey down a slippery, often muddy bank, carrying empty buckets. The air here would be cooler, fresher, smelling of damp earth and river water. Filling the buckets required careful balance on the sometimes treacherous edges of the water, leaning over to submerge the containers without losing balance and falling into the current. The weight of 2 full wooden or metal buckets, each capable of holding several gallons of water, was substantial. Once filled, the true burden commenced, the walk back. Imagine carrying these heavy buckets, one in each hand, their weight pulling on the shoulders, straining the back, and making every step a deliberate effort. The path might be uphill, uneven, or obstructed by rocks and roots. The sloshing of the water, threatening to spill with every misstep, demanded careful balance and a steady gait. The distance could be significant, sometimes a quarter mile, sometimes much more, and this journey was not a singular event. It was repeated countless times throughout the day, every day, regardless of the season or the weather. In the scorching heat of summer, the task was almost unbearable. The sun would beat down relentlessly, making the water in the buckets feel heavier, and causing sweat to pour, dehydrating the body. The thirst would be constant, a cruel irony given the nature of the task. In the biting cold of winter, the challenge transformed. The well water would be icy, chilling the hands to the bone. The paths could be treacherous with ice or deep snow, making footing precarious. The water itself, if left for too long, might begin to freeze in the buckets. Imagine the effort of breaking through a thin layer of ice, or carrying frozen lumps of water, the cold seeping into every layer of clothing. Falls were a constant risk, leading to spilled water, a frustrating setback that meant retracing one's steps to the source, or, worse, injury from a fall on uneven ground. The constant strain on the body, particularly the back, shoulders, and knees, would lead to chronic aches and pains. Hands would be chapped and rough from exposure to water and cold. Beyond the physical demands, there was the sheer monotony of the task. It was a repetitive, unending chore, devoid of glory or recognition, yet absolutely indispensable. Every aspect of colonial life, from the preparation of food to personal hygiene, was dependent on the tireless efforts of the water carrier. As evening descended, and the last of the day's water had been hauled and emptied into storage barrels or cisterns, the water carrier would finally put down their burdens. The ache in their muscles, the roughness of their hands, and the lingering dampness of their clothes would be a silent testament to a day spent in quiet, essential toil. Their life was a testament to the raw, unadorned effort required to sustain daily existence in a world where every basic necessity had to be earned through direct, physical labor. From the arduous, repetitive journey of the water carrier, we now transition to another fundamental and tirelessly demanding aspect of colonial domestic life, the work of a laundress. Imagine, if you will, a scene outside a colonial home, or perhaps near a flowing stream or river, where the daily ritual of cleaning textiles unfolds. The air, depending on the season, might be crisp and cold, or warm and humid, carrying the damp, clean scent of wet cloth, mingled with the faint, biting aroma of homemade lye soap. The sounds are rhythmic and persistent, the slapping of wet fabric against a washboard or stone, the splashing of water, the occasional grunt of effort, and the gentle sigh of linen as it's wrung dry. This was not the quick, convenient wash of a modern machine. It was a full-body, laborious process that consumed hours, even days, of a woman's life. The colonial laundress, whether a household member performing her family's chores or a woman hired for her services in a wealthier home, faced a task that was both physically taxing and chemically harsh. Her materials were simple: water, soap, and raw strength. This soap, itself, was often homemade, a strong, caustic concoction of animal fat, tallow, and lye derived from wood ashes, effective at cutting grease and dirt but also harsh on the hands. The process began with gathering the laundry. Imagine piles of soiled linen, wool, and cotton, clothing, bedding, dishcloths, all requiring thorough cleaning. There was no sorting by color or fabric type in the modern sense. Everything was often washed together, demanding a robust cleaning method. Next came the pre-soak, often in a large wooden tub filled with water. Heavily soiled items might be left to soak overnight to loosen the dirt. Imagine the stagnant, murky water, the lingering odor of sweat and grime, as the fabric steeped. Then came the main wash. If the laundry was done at a stream or river, imagine the laundress kneeling on the bank, her hands plunged into the often cold, flowing water. She would take one garment at a time, apply the harsh lye soap directly, and then begin the relentless process of scrubbing. This might involve rubbing the fabric vigorously between her hands, against a rough stone, or, if she was fortunate, against a corrugated wooden washboard. The sound of wet fabric being rubbed and scrubbed, the splashing of water, and the steady friction against the washboard would fill the air. The harshness of the lye soap would quickly chap and redden her hands, making them rough and sore. For laundry done at home, large wash tubs would be set up, often over a fire to heat the water, a difficult and dangerous task of boiling water in heavy iron pots, and then carefully transferring it. The steam would rise, warming the small space, but also obscuring vision and making the air thick with moisture. The scrubbing motion remained the same, demanding relentless physical exertion. After scrubbing, came the rinsing. This was crucial to remove all traces of the harsh soap, which, if left in the fabric, could irritate the skin and degrade the cloth. If at a stream, the laundress would hold the garment in the flowing current until the water ran clear. If at home, she would repeatedly dunk and agitate the items in several changes of clean water, each tub needing to be refilled, adding to the burden of water carrying. Imagine the repetitive motion of lifting heavy, waterlogged fabric, swishing it through clean water, and then repeating the entire process. Finally, the wringing. This was perhaps the most physically demanding part. Imagine twisting and squeezing the heavy, dripping fabric with all her strength to extract as much water as possible. The muscles in her forearms and wrists would ache, and the cold water, especially in winter, would make her fingers stiff and painful. The sound of water being forced from the fabric, dripping onto the ground, was a satisfying, if exhausting, conclusion to this stage. Once wrung, the laundry had to be dried. In good weather, this meant hanging items on lines strung between trees or poles, or simply spreading them out on clean grass, allowing the sun and wind to do their work. In inclement weather, drying became a prolonged nightmare, draping items over chairs near a fireplace, or hanging them from rafters, where they would slowly air dry, often retaining a damp, musty smell. The work of a colonial laundress was a relentless cycle of physical exertion, exposure to harsh chemicals, and constant battling with the elements. There was no escaping the chore. Cleanliness, though rudimentary by modern standards, was a necessity for health and dignity. Her hands, perpetually reddened and rough, bore the indelible mark of her daily toil, a quiet testament to the unseen, yet utterly essential, labor that kept colonial households functioning. From the strenuous and often damp world of the colonial laundress, we now move to a more tranquil, yet equally demanding, sphere of colonial life, the garden. Imagine, if you will, a small plot of land behind a humble cottage, or perhaps a larger, more organized field on a sprawling plantation. The air is fresh and earthy, carrying the scent of damp soil, growing green things, and the occasional sweet fragrance of budding flowers or ripening fruit. The sounds are gentle, a quiet symphony of nature and human effort, the soft rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, the distant buzzing of bees, the quiet scrape of a hoe against soil, and the occasional soft thud of pulled weeds. This was not a hobby. It was a fundamental necessity, the direct link between the earth and the family's sustenance. The colonial gardener, whether a household member tending to a kitchen garden or a dedicated laborer managing larger fields, played a vital role in ensuring the survival and well-being of their community. Their year was dictated by the unyielding rhythms of the seasons, demanding constant vigilance and tireless physical effort. Consider the early spring. The ground, still cold and perhaps damp from winter's thaw, needed to be prepared. Imagine the arduous task of tilling the soil, often by hand with a hoe or spade, breaking up stubborn clumps of earth, and removing rocks and roots. This was back-breaking work, the muscles in the arms and back aching with each swing and plunge. The cold, damp earth would cling to hands and tools, making the work even more strenuous. Once the soil was prepared, came the delicate, yet crucial, act of planting. Seeds, often saved from the previous year's harvest, were carefully sown by hand. Corn, beans, pumpkins, squash, these staples formed the backbone of the colonial diet. Imagine the gardener kneeling for hours, meticulously placing each seed, their fingers callous yet surprisingly nimble. The hopeful anticipation of the coming harvest would be a quiet motivator in the chill spring air. As the plants began to emerge, so did the relentless battle against weeds. Imagine spending countless hours stooping or kneeling between rows, pulling unwanted plants by hand or with a hoe. Weeds competed for precious nutrients and water, and if left unchecked, could quickly choke out an entire crop, threatening the family's food supply. This was a monotonous, yet absolutely critical, daily chore, performed under the blazing sun or in the humid aftermath of a rain shower. The scent of freshly disturbed earth and crushed green leaves would be a constant presence. Watering was another constant challenge, particularly during dry spells. As we've explored, water had to be hauled by hand from wells, rivers, or rain barrels. Imagine the endless trips, carrying heavy buckets, carefully pouring water around each thirsty plant, ensuring that every precious drop reached its intended destination. The sun would beat down, the ground would crack, and the gardener's throat would often be parched, a stark reminder of the fragile balance of nature. Beyond weeds and water there were other threats. Pests, insects, rodents, and larger animals could decimate a crop overnight. The gardener had to be constantly vigilant, employing rudimentary methods of pest control, such as hand-picking destructive insects or constructing simple fences to deter hungry deer or rabbits. Disease could also sweep through a garden, turning lush green plants into withered brown husks, a silent and devastating blow. The harvest, when it finally arrived, was a moment of immense satisfaction, but also intense labor. Imagine gathering bushels of corn, pulling heavy pumpkins from their vines, or picking countless beans, often under a hot, late summer sun. This bounty then needed to be processed: corn shelled, beans dried, pumpkins stored in cool cellars for winter. The colonial gardener's life was a testament to patience, perseverance, and a deep connection to the land. Their hands, often stained with earth and scarred by thorns, were the instruments of growth, nurturing life from the soil. Their days, though marked by endless toil and the constant threat of natural setbacks, held a profound beauty in their simplicity and directness, reminding us of the fundamental efforts required to sustain human existence in the heart of colonial America. From the cultivated plots of the colonial gardener, we now journey deep into the vast, untamed forests that covered much of early America, to explore the harsh, perilous life of a colonial lumberjack. Imagine, if you will, the dense, shadowy depths of a pristine forest, where towering trees, untouched for centuries, reach skyward. The air is cool and damp, carrying the sharp, resinous scent of pine and the earthy aroma of decaying leaves and rich soil. The sounds are dominated by nature, the distant calls of birds, the rustle of unseen animals, and then, piercing the quiet, the rhythmic, powerful thud of axes striking wood, echoing through the trees like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. This was not a gentle occupation. It was a brutal, muscle-straining confrontation with the raw power of the wilderness, essential for providing the very building blocks of colonial expansion. The colonial lumberjack, often a man of immense physical strength and unwavering endurance, faced a daily existence defined by danger and unrelenting labor. His tools were simple yet formidable: the broadaxe for felling and hewing, the crosscut saw for bucking logs, and wedges for splitting timber. His work was solitary or done in small, isolated crews, far removed from the comforts of settlement. Consider the act of felling a tree. Imagine standing at the base of a massive pine or oak, its trunk easily a foot or more in diameter. With a heavy, sharp broadaxe, the lumberjack would begin to cut a notch on one side, a precise, angled cut to guide the direction of the fall. The chips would fly, thick and fragrant, as he swung the axe with powerful, coordinated strokes, the muscles in his arms and back straining with each impact. Then, he would move to the opposite side, beginning the back cut, the saw biting deep into the wood with a rhythmic, grating sound. As the cut deepened, the tree would begin to groan, a low, ominous creak, signaling its impending descent. This was the moment of extreme peril. The lumberjack had to judge the fall precisely, predicting the path of the massive trunk, the direction of falling branches, and the potential for widowmakers, detached branches that could snap off and fall unexpectedly. Imagine the deafening crash as the giant tree finally succumbed, shaking the very earth, sending up a cloud of sawdust and snapping twigs. A miscalculation, a moment of inattention, and a falling tree could crush a man instantly, leaving little trace. Once felled, the tree had to be limbed, removing branches, and then bucked, cut into manageable lengths, using the heavy, two-man crosscut saw. Imagine the synchronized pull and push of two men on the saw, their bodies swaying with the rhythm, sawdust flying, the scent of fresh cut wood thick in the air. Each cut was a long, arduous process, particularly for large trunks. Then came the immense challenge of moving the logs. There were no powerful machines. Everything was done with brute force, leverage, and the aid of draft animals like oxen or horses. Imagine using peavies and cant hooks to roll heavy logs, straining every muscle, the bark rough and splintering under the grip. Logs often had to be dragged out of the dense forest to a river or a clearing, a slow, grueling process over uneven terrain, through mud, and over obstacles. The dangers of the lumberjack's life were constant and severe. Beyond falling trees, there was the risk of axes and saws slipping, causing deep, debilitating cuts. Logs could roll unexpectedly, crushing limbs or bodies. Splinters, cuts, and strained muscles were daily occurrences. In winter, working in deep snow and bitter cold, the risk of frostbite and hypothermia was ever present. Summers brought swarms of biting insects and the threat of venomous snakes. Moreover, the isolation of the lumber camps was profound. Weeks, sometimes months, would pass without contact with the outside world, save for the occasional supply run. Life was rough, food was basic, and shelter was crude, often little more than a lean-to or a primitive cabin. The constant physical exertion, coupled with poor nutrition and basic sanitation, often led to illness and exhaustion. Yet, the colonial lumberjack was an indispensable force in shaping the landscape of early America. His tireless efforts provided the timber for houses, barns, ships, fences, and firewood for countless hearths. His strength and resilience were the silent engines of colonial expansion, transforming the raw wilderness into the structured spaces of human habitation. His life, marked by endless labor and ever-present danger, was a testament to the raw, enduring human will to carve out a living from the heart of the untamed world. From the deep, dangerous heart of the colonial forest where the lumberjack toiled, we now delve even further into its hidden depths, to a profession that often went unseen, yet was absolutely vital, the life of a colonial charcoal burner. Imagine, if you will, a secluded clearing, far from any settlement, where the air hangs heavy with the distinct, smoky aroma of smoldering wood, a scent that permeates everything and clings to the very landscape. The sounds here are minimal: the gentle whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional crackle of a distant, controlled burn, and the subtle, persistent hum of insects. This was a solitary existence, a patient vigil over a slow, deliberate transformation, turning common wood into a cleaner, more efficient fuel. The colonial charcoal burner was an unsung hero of the burgeoning industries. Charcoal, a pure carbon residue created by heating wood in a low-oxygen environment, was an indispensable fuel. It burned hotter and more cleanly than raw wood, making it ideal for blacksmiths, iron smelters, glassblowers, and various other artisans who relied on intense, sustained heat. Without charcoal, many colonial industries would simply grind to a halt. The process of making charcoal was ancient and deceptively simple, yet it required immense skill, patience, and constant vigilance. It began with the careful selection and preparation of wood. Imagine the burner felling trees himself, or collecting the discarded limbs and smaller trunks left by lumberjacks. This wood, usually hardwoods like oak or maple, would be cut into uniform lengths and stacked meticulously. The heart of the operation was the charcoal kiln or pit. This wasn't a permanent structure but a carefully constructed mound of wood, often several feet high and wide, arranged in a precise pattern to allow for controlled burning. Imagine the painstaking effort of stacking the wood tightly around a central flue, creating a conical or domed shape. Once the mound was built, it would be covered with layers of earth, sod, and leaves, forming a thick, airtight skin. Small vents would be left at the bottom, and a chimney-like opening at the top, to control the airflow. Then came the delicate and crucial act of firing the kiln. A small fire would be lit in the central flue, and the burner would carefully monitor its progress, ensuring the wood smoldered rather than bursting into open flame. This was not a quick process. The wood had to burn slowly, carbonizing in the low-oxygen environment. Too much air, and the wood would burn to ash. Too little, and it wouldn't fully carbonize. Imagine the burner's days and nights, spent in constant vigil over the smoldering mound. He would patrol the perimeter, watching for telltale wisps of blue smoke indicating a good burn, or thicker, white smoke signaling too much oxygen and potential flame. He might poke small holes in the covering to release trapped gases, or quickly seal a spot where the smoke was too thick. The air around him would be filled with the pervasive, slightly acrid smell of wood smoke, clinging to his clothes, hair, and skin. The process could take days, even weeks, depending on the size of the kiln and the type of wood. Throughout this time, the charcoal burner's life was one of profound isolation. His camp would be crude, often a simple lean-to or a small, temporary cabin. His meals would be basic, cooked over a small, separate fire. His only companions would be the sounds of the forest and the silent, ongoing work of his smoldering kiln. This solitude demanded a particular kind of mental fortitude, a comfort with one's own company, and an acute awareness of the subtle changes in his environment. The dangers, though less dramatic than a falling tree, were insidious. The constant exposure to smoke and fumes, particularly carbon monoxide, posed a silent health threat, leading to lung issues over time. Burns from hot earth or escaping embers were common. And working in remote areas meant little or no access to help if an accident or illness struck. Finally, when the smoldering process was complete, and the kiln had cooled, another period of patient waiting, came the arduous task of uncovering the charcoal. Imagine carefully removing the layers of earth and sod, revealing the black, brittle pieces of carbonized wood within. The charcoal had to be carefully handled, as it was fragile and could easily crumble. It would then be bagged or loaded onto carts, ready for transport to the waiting blacksmiths and industrialists. The life of a colonial charcoal burner was a testament to quiet dedication, technical skill, and immense patience. His obscure labor, performed in the depths of the forest, fueled the very engines of colonial progress, turning raw nature into the concentrated power needed to build and thrive. His enduring legacy, though often unseen, was the steady, clean flame that powered a developing nation. From the remote, smoky clearings of the charcoal burner, we now journey to another essential, yet often overlooked, colonial workshop, that of the cooper. Imagine, if you will, a sturdy, specialized shed or building, its interior filled with the sweet, pungent aroma of seasoned wood, oak, pine, or cedar, and the sharp tang of metal tools. The sounds within are rhythmic and distinct, the ringing clang of a hammer against an iron hoop, the resonant thud of a mallet shaping wood, the rasp of a plane shaving a precise curve, and the gentle, almost musical, creak of wood being bent and fitted. This was the domain of the cooper, a master craftsman whose skill in crafting wooden barrels, casks, and buckets was absolutely vital to every facet of colonial life. The colonial cooper was indispensable. Before the advent of modern packaging and refrigeration, barrels were the primary means of storing and transporting almost every liquid and many dry goods. From rum, wine, and beer to salted pork, fish, flour, and even nails, everything that needed to be kept, preserved, or moved over any distance relied on the cooper's meticulous craft. His work directly supported trade, agriculture, and the very sustenance of the community. The process of coopering was a complex, multi-stage endeavor, demanding immense precision, strength, and an intuitive understanding of wood. It began with the careful selection and preparation of the staves, the individual wooden planks that would form the body of the barrel. Imagine the cooper meticulously examining rough-sawn oak, checking for flaws, knots, or uneven grain. He would then shape each stave, using specialized planes and draw knives, not just to a specific length and width, but to a precise curve. Each stave had to be subtly wider in the middle and narrower at the ends, and slightly beveled along its edges, so that when assembled, they would naturally form a tight, watertight cylinder. The air would fill with the delicate scent of freshly planed wood. Once shaped, the staves would be arranged around a circular base, often held temporarily by a temporary iron hoop. Then came the critical process of raising the barrel. Imagine the cooper, using a combination of mallets and sheer physical force, slowly, painstakingly pulling the staves together at the top, bending the stiff wood inward. This often involved the application of heat and steam, making the wood more pliable, the air becoming thick with the humid, woody scent. The sound of groaning wood, and the cooper's grunts of effort, would fill the workshop. As the barrel took shape, a series of iron hoops would be driven down the outside, progressively forcing the staves tighter and tighter together. Imagine the rhythmic clang of the cooper's hammer against the iron bands, each precise blow driving the hoop further, cinching the wood into its final, sturdy form. This required immense accuracy. Too hard a blow could split the stave, too light and the hoop would not hold. The next crucial step was creating the grooves, crows, where the head and bottom of the barrel would sit. Using a specialized tool, the cooper would cut a precise, circular groove on the inside of each end of the assembled barrel. This groove had to be perfectly consistent to ensure a watertight fit for the circular wooden heads, or discs, that would seal the barrel. The scraping sound of the crows cutting into the wood, and the scattering of fine wood shavings, would be a constant presence. Finally, the heads themselves were made from several pieces of wood, joined together and cut into a perfect circle. These were then carefully inserted into the crow's grooves, and a final set of hoops hammered into place, locking the heads securely. For liquid containers, the barrel then had to be tested for leaks, often filled with water or beer, with any tiny gaps meticulously sealed with wax or pitch. The work was physically demanding, leading to strained muscles, calloused hands, and the constant risk of cuts and scrapes from sharp tools. The repetitive bending and lifting of heavy staves and finished barrels would take a toll on the back and knees. The precision required for shaping wood and fitting components was immense, and a single mistake could ruin hours of work and valuable material. Yet, the cooper's finished product was a thing of robust beauty, perfectly functional and immensely durable. Each barrel was a testament to his skill and patience, a silent vessel of colonial commerce and sustenance. The colonial cooper, with his deep knowledge of wood and his tireless hands, was a foundational craftsman, ensuring that the bounty of the colonies could be preserved, transported, and ultimately consumed, playing a vital, if often unheralded, role in the daily life of early America. From the meticulously crafted world of the cooper and his barrels, we now turn to a far less celebrated, yet undeniably crucial, aspect of colonial urban life, the tireless work of a colonial street sweeper. Imagine, if you will, the bustling thoroughfares of a growing colonial town in the 18th century, not as romanticized by history books, but in its raw, unfiltered reality. The air is often thick with a pervasive mixture of dust, the acrid scent of horse manure, the earthy smell of unpaved roads, and the lingering odors of human activity and waste. The sounds are a constant, low-level din, the distant shouts of merchants, the clatter of horse hooves and wooden cart wheels, the occasional bark of a dog, and cutting through it all, the rhythmic, scraping sound of a broom or shovel against the uneven surface of the street. This was a profession demanding immense physical effort, a strong constitution, and a stoic acceptance of perpetual grime. The colonial street sweeper was, in essence, the unsung custodian of public health and order in a world without modern sanitation systems. Their job was to battle the endless accumulation of waste that was a natural byproduct of urban life. Roads were rarely paved, meaning they were often muddy quagmires after rain and dusty plains in dry spells. Animals were ubiquitous, providing transportation but leaving behind their copious droppings. Garbage was often simply tossed into the street, and human waste, from chamber pots, found its way into gutters. Imagine the early morning, often before dawn, when the sweeper's day would begin. While others slept, he would already be at work, armed with a heavy, coarse broom made of stiff bristles or branches, and a sturdy shovel. His clothing would be simple, durable, and perpetually stained with the grime of his trade. The work was relentlessly physical. Imagine the sustained effort of pushing and pulling a heavy broom across uneven ground, sweeping piles of mud, horse manure, straw, and general refuse to the side of the road or into designated collection points. Each stroke was a physical exertion, demanding strength from the arms, back, and shoulders. The dust raised by his efforts would often coat his face and clothes, clinging to his eyelashes and settling into his lungs. The quantity of waste was staggering. A single horse could produce dozens of pounds of manure each day, and with countless horses moving through the streets, the accumulation was rapid and immense. After heavy rains, the streets would turn into thick, viscous mud, often several inches deep, making the task of clearing it even more arduous. Imagine sinking into the mire, the mud squelching beneath his heavy boots, coating his clothes, and adding significant weight to every shovelful. The smells were constant and often overpowering. The sharp, ammoniac scent of fresh manure, the putrid odor of decaying organic matter, and the general smell of an unwashed populace would be his constant companions. He would become accustomed to these scents, but they were an undeniable part of his daily reality. Beyond the physical toil and the unpleasant sensory experience, there were other challenges. The work was often solitary, performed under the watchful, sometimes disdainful, eyes of passers-by. It was a low-status job, often undertaken by those with few other options, and it afforded little respect. He might be scoffed at, or ignored, a silent, almost invisible figure in the background of the bustling town. The elements were a constant adversary. In the scorching heat of summer, the sun would beat down mercilessly, drying the mud into cake dust that billowed with every sweep, and intensifying the already pungent odors. The sweat would pour, and dehydration would be a constant threat. In the biting cold of winter, the mud could freeze solid, requiring immense effort to chip away with a shovel. His hands would be numb, his body shivering, and the raw wind would cut through his layers of clothing. Injuries, though not as dramatic as those faced by a lumberjack, were common: strained muscles, aching joints, blisters, and persistent coughs from inhaling dust and fumes. There was no concept of protective gear beyond his basic clothing. As the day progressed, the piles of refuse would slowly grow, a testament to the sweeper's tireless efforts. He would guide his accumulations to a dumping ground outside the town, or perhaps a designated pit, adding another arduous leg to his daily journey. The work was endless, a Sisyphean task where the dirt and waste would simply reappear the next day, demanding renewed effort. The life of a colonial street sweeper was one of relentless, often thankless, physical labor in a perpetually unclean environment. His quiet, determined efforts, though often unseen and unappreciated, were absolutely vital for preventing disease, maintaining some semblance of urban order, and allowing the rest of colonial society to function. His story is one of profound resilience in the face of constant grime, a testament to the essential, overlooked struggles that shaped the very fabric of colonial towns. From the dusty, hard-scrabble streets where the sweeper toiled, we now step across the threshold into the seemingly more refined, yet equally demanding, world of a colonial wealthy home. Here, we encounter the often invisible figure of the housemaid, whose days were a relentless cycle of physical labor, personal subservience, and the constant navigation of a rigid social hierarchy. Imagine, if you will, the elegant parlor or grand kitchen of a prominent colonial family, perhaps in a thriving port city. The air within such a home might carry the scent of beeswax polish, imported spices, freshly baked bread, or the faint, sweet perfume of the mistress of the house. Yet, beneath these pleasant aromas, there was always the underlying smell of labor, soap, damp linens, and the lingering residue of cooking. The sounds, though generally quieter than the street, were ever present: the gentle creak of polished floorboards, the muffled clatter of dishes, the rustle of voluminous skirts, and the soft, hurried footsteps of the housemaid, constantly moving from one task to the next. The colonial housemaid's life was one of perpetual motion, dictated by the demands of her employer, and the endless cycle of household chores. Often a young woman from a poorer family, or perhaps an indentured servant, she had little personal freedom, and her day began long before her employers stirred from their comfortable beds. Imagine her rising in the pre-dawn darkness, perhaps from a small, unheated attic room or a simple cot in the kitchen. Her first tasks would be to light the fires in the numerous fireplaces throughout the house, ensuring warmth for the family. This involved hauling heavy logs, carefully laying kindling, and tending to the embers, a cold and sooty start to her day. The smell of wood smoke, at first strong, would gradually dissipate into the house's general aroma. Next came the arduous task of preparing the morning meal. This might involve churning butter, grinding coffee beans by hand, slicing cured meats, or preparing porridge over an open hearth. The kitchen, often a busy and chaotic space, would quickly fill with the sounds of preparation and the warm sense of cooking food. The maid would serve the family, often standing silently to the side, then clear the dishes, and embark on the endless process of washing. As we explored with the laundress, this was a strenuous task, involving hot water, harsh soap, and endless scrubbing and rinsing. After meals, the cleaning of the house began in earnest. Imagine scrubbing floors, often on her hands and knees, with stiff brushes and buckets of water. The cold, wet floor, the relentless friction, and the caustic soap would take a toll on her hands and knees. Dusting every surface, polishing furniture with beeswax, sweeping carpets with brooms, each task was repetitive and demanding, requiring meticulous attention to detail. A single speck of dust or a smudge on a polished surface could earn her a sharp rebuke from the mistress. The housemaid was also responsible for maintaining the family's extensive wardrobe. This included not only washing, as we've discussed, but also ironing, a laborious process with heavy, heated irons that often required strong arms and careful handling to avoid scorching delicate fabrics. She would also mend clothes, sewing rips and replacing buttons, a never-ending chore given the wear and tear of daily life. Beyond these regular duties, there were countless other tasks: fetching water from the well, emptying chamber pots, a particularly unpleasant and odorous duty, carrying messages, tending to children, and assisting with social events. During parties or dinners, her work would extend late into the night, serving guests, cleaning up spills, and finally, after everyone else was asleep, beginning the lengthy process of restoring order to the house. The physical toll was immense: aching back and knees from constant bending, scrubbing, and lifting, reddened, chapped hands from hot, soapy water, and chronic exhaustion from long hours and little rest. Her life was defined by the needs of others, with little time or energy for her own pursuits. Privacy was almost non-existent, and personal desires were almost always subjugated to the demands of the household. The social dynamics within the household were also a constant negotiation. While some employers might be benevolent, others could be demanding, temperamental, or even abusive. The maid had little recourse against ill treatment, her livelihood and shelter entirely dependent on the goodwill of her employers. Yet, despite the hardship, the colonial housemaid was an indispensable part of the wealthy household, enabling the genteel lifestyles of the upper classes. Her unseen efforts maintained the beauty, cleanliness, and functionality of these homes, allowing the families to participate in the social and economic life of the colonies. Her quiet, unwavering diligence was the silent engine of domestic order, a testament to the enduring human capacity for labor and resilience in the face of constant demands. And so, our long, quiet journey through the demanding realities of colonial America slowly draws to its close. We have walked the muddy streets with the street sweeper, felt the biting cold of the sea with the fisherman, heard the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and smelled the comforting aroma of the baker's oven. We have glimpsed lives shaped by raw effort, by the whims of nature, and by the relentless march of necessity. These were not lives of grand narratives or historical fanfare, but rather lives woven from the everyday struggles, the persistent demands of survival, and the quiet dignity of honest labor. Each individual we imagined, from the tavern worker to the housemaid, contributed their indelible thread to the vast tapestry of a burgeoning nation. Their challenges, their small triumphs, and their unwavering resilience built the very foundations upon which our modern world now stands. As the echoes of their distant toils fade, and the scents of wood smoke, damp earth, and fresh bread gently recede, allow yourself to drift. The past, in all its demanding reality, has offered its lessons. Now, as the last whispers of history settle, let the quiet calm envelop you. Rest deeply, and find solace in the comfort of your own time, a comfort made possible by the arduous, unyielding efforts of those who came before. Good night.